The late afternoon light rested quietly on the windowsill, the kind of dim golden glow that softens everything it touches. In that gentle fading light, Anthony Hopkins, now 90, sat in his favorite armchair, still elegant, still dignified, but carrying in his eyes a depth that could not be hidden anymore. Age had not diminished his presence. If anything, it had sharpened it, carving into his face the traces of a lifetime spent navigating brilliance, loneliness, triumph, and silence. The room around him seemed suspended in time. No noise from outside, no hurried footsteps, only the faint hum of air drifting across the wooden floor. He looked toward the window, as if searching for someone in the distance, someone only he could see. When a close friend finally spoke, softly, carefully, Hopkins didn't answer right away. He closed his eyes for a moment, gathering something fragile inside him. And then, in a voice low and almost trembling, he said, "There is something I have carried my entire life, something I have never told anyone." The words did not sound like a confession of guilt, nor a revelation meant to shock. They sounded like the release of a man who had lived with a weight for far too long. Longer than fame, longer than accolades, longer than the characters that shaped his legend. His hands rested gently on his lap, but there was a subtle tremor, a reminder of how difficult it was to lift the truth into the open after 9 decades of silence. He looked down, as if afraid to meet his friend's gaze, and whispered, "It began when I was a boy, long before I ever knew what the world expected me to become." And with those words, the door to his past, kept locked for almost a century, began to open. To understand the secret Anthony Hopkins hid for nearly a century, one must return to the earliest chapters of his life, years that the world, enamored with his genius, often forgets. Before the awards, before the applause, before the characters that defined entire eras, there was simply a quiet boy growing up in Margam, Wales. A boy who learned far too early that loneliness can arrive long before one knows the meaning of the word. He was born in 1937 in a working-class family that did what it could to survive. His parents were kind, modest people, but life was not gentle. The shop they ran demanded long hours, and young Anthony often found himself alone, wandering through the stillness of the house, filling the silence with his own imagination. Some children grow in the warmth of constant affection, others grow in the shadows of absence. Hopkins belonged to the latter. He remembered sitting at the kitchen table as a child, listening to the distant hum of the outside world, while feeling an odd emptiness settling in his chest. It wasn't sadness, not yet. It was something quieter, something colder, a sense that he existed on the periphery of everyone else's life. As he would later say in interviews, he felt different, isolated not by cruelty, but by an invisible wall he couldn't name. School did not help. The bustling classrooms, the shouted conversations, the laughter that bounced between the walls. All of it made him feel like an outsider looking through glass. Teachers called him slow, distracted, inattentive. In their eyes, he wasn't someone to be encouraged. He was someone to be tolerated. The sting of those labels lodged itself deep inside him, and that wound would guide him unconsciously for decades. But it wasn't only school. Even at home, the affection he longed for felt just out of reach. His parents loved him, but life forced them to love him from a distance. They worked tirelessly, and in their absence, he learned to retreat into drawing, into the piano, into stories he built in his mind. Worlds where he could shape emotions that, in reality, no one noticed. As he grew older, he began to understand something painful. The world rarely sees the quiet child, and the quiet child learns to expect very little from anyone. It was in that quiet, in that early isolation, that the secret he carried throughout his life first took root, a secret that would follow him into adolescence, into fame, into old age, and eventually, into the final confession he would make at 90. As Anthony Hopkins moved from adolescence into adulthood, the world began to reveal a calling he had never truly expected. Acting was not a dream he had chased with youthful certainty. It was more like a refuge, a place where he could finally become someone other than the lonely boy from Margam. A stage, quite literally, on which he could hide and be seen at the same time. His early years in drama school were marked by a strange mixture of brilliance and insecurity. Teachers recognized something extraordinary in him, a raw, instinctive depth that could not be taught. But beneath his talent, a silent fear pulsed constantly, the fear of being inadequate, of being overlooked, of being once again the boy no one quite understood. His performances glowed with an intensity that astonished many, but that intensity was not born from confidence. It was born from hunger, a hunger to prove something, perhaps even to himself. Then came the theater, and with it the first taste of real recognition. He found himself under the shadow of giants, including Laurence Olivier. Hopkins admired him deeply, yet also felt the weight of his presence press against his own fragile sense of self. Fame was beginning to notice him, but it approached slowly, cautiously, like a flame testing whether he could withstand the heat. The world finally came to know his name when he transitioned to film. And in 1991, with The Silence of the Lambs, the transformation was complete. In just 16 minutes of screen time, Anthony Hopkins etched Hannibal Lecter into cinematic history. The performance was chilling, magnetic, unforgettable. The world was mesmerized. Critics called him a genius. Audiences called him legendary. But behind the acclaim, a different story was unfolding. Hopkins's ascent into global stardom did not erase the loneliness of his youth. It amplified it. The more the world celebrated him, the more he felt the strange disconnect between who he appeared to be and who he truly was. He was praised for his brilliance, yet inside he often felt like a man building himself anew for every role because he never truly believed in the person he was without a script. The spotlight is a deceptive companion. It warms, but it also blinds. And for Hopkins, its warmth sometimes felt like a warning. There were late nights when he sat alone in hotel rooms after premieres, the applause still echoing in his ears. He would stare at the walls, listening to the silence settle back into place, heavier than before. The world loved him, but the world loved the characters. And once the camera stopped rolling, the old doubts returned, whispering in familiar tones. You're still that boy, still unseen, still waiting for someone to tell you who you are. He gave the world everything. His intensity, his vulnerability, the shadows of his past woven seamlessly into each performance. But with each masterpiece, the cracks behind the curtain deepened. He had mastered the art of becoming others, because he had never fully learned how to be himself. And in those widening cracks, the secret that had taken root in his childhood silently continued to grow. A secret that fame could not bury, a secret that success could not silence, a secret that one day would demand to be spoken aloud. With age came recognition, reverence, and a kind of quiet glory few actors ever experience. Anthony Hopkins had become more than a performer. He was a presence, a timeless figure who seemed carved into the very foundation of cinema. But while the world saw a master at the peak of his craft, within him, another battle was unfolding, one far more personal than any character he had ever played. There is a moment in every life when noise begins to fade, when the rush of ambition and the storm of expectation settle into something quieter. For Hopkins, this moment arrived gradually. There was no dramatic collapse, no sudden shift. Instead, a slow softening, like fog rising around the edges of his days. Interviews became fewer, public appearances rarer. The once ceaseless demand on his mind and spirit began to loosen, yet the heaviness inside him did not. He spoke less, not out of secrecy, but because silence seemed easier than pretending. His mind wandered more often into corners of memory he had avoided for decades. Childhood, loneliness, the echo of old doubts. Sometimes when he sat alone in his home in Malibu, watching the ocean stretch endlessly toward the horizon, a sense of unfinished reckoning settled beside him, like a long-ignored companion. He had spent years mastering his inner turmoil on screen, turning pain into performance. But now, far from the lights, the old wounds resurfaced, not as dramatic crises, but as quiet tremors. There were mornings when he woke with the strange heaviness of dreams he could not remember. Nights when he lay awake long after the house had fallen silent, feeling the weight of time pressing gently, insistently against his chest. Friends noticed the change. He laughed, yes, but the laughter was softer. He replied to messages, but sometimes hours later, as if collecting the energy to face even simple connections. He often sat by the piano, playing slow, wandering melodies that sounded less like music and more like questions without answers. And in between the notes, in the pauses, in the slight tremble of his fingers, there was something unspoken. It was not illness that burdened him most, though his age brought the expected frailties. It was memory. Memory and the truth he had spent nearly a lifetime suppressing. There were days when emotions swept over him without warning. A familiar song on the radio, a photograph forgotten in a drawer, the way sunlight filtered through a window, just as it had in his childhood home. Each small trigger was a thread pulling him closer to the secret at the heart of his life, the one he had never dared to name. He found himself writing more, short letters he never sent, reflections left unfinished in notebooks, lines that dissolved halfway through, as if the words themselves were too heavy to carry. Sometimes, during these moments, he would whisper to himself, almost involuntarily, "It's time, isn't it? Time to tell the truth he had feared since boyhood. Time to give voice to the silence he had lived with for 90 years. And in this quiet, fragile period, when fame no longer shielded him and success no longer defined him, the secret finally began rising to the surface. Not with drama, but with inevitability. For there are truths that grow heavier the longer they are held. Truths that wait patiently in the shadows, knowing that eventually, even the strongest among us must face them. Hopkins was no exception. The final weeks of Anthony Hopkins's 90-year journey were marked by an unusual stillness. Not the stillness of resignation, nor the stillness of despair. It was something quieter, deeper, a kind of inward turning, as though his life were folding back on itself, revealing hidden pages he had never shared with anyone. The world outside carried on as it always had. But inside his home, time seemed to slow, as if waiting for him to speak the truth he had guarded for almost a century. Visitors described a gentle lightness in him, mixed with a depth that seemed to widen each day. He smiled often, but his smiles carried a reflective softness. His voice remained warm, but the pauses between his words grew longer, as though something inside him weighed each sentence before allowing it to come out. It was clear he was preparing, not for an end, but for honesty. One late afternoon, in the quiet golden hour he loved so much, Hopkins sat in his armchair, wrapped in a blanket, the ocean breeze drifting through the open window. A close friend sat nearby, sensing that he was holding something close to the surface, ready to break through. For a long while, Hopkins said nothing. He simply stared at the horizon, watching the light sink into the waves. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "There is something I must tell you. Something I've never said to anyone." His friend leaned forward, not with curiosity but with care. Knowing this was a moment Hopkins had been approaching his entire life, Hopkins exhaled deeply, as though letting out years of restrained breath. "People think I've lived a grand life," he began. "Acclaim, success, all the rest of it. But behind all of that, I've carried a silence that shaped everything." He paused, eyes glistening, not with tears but with memory. "When I was a boy," he continued slowly, "I believed something that changed me, something I never overcame." His hands trembled slightly as he clasped them together. "I believed I wasn't wanted." The words hung in the room like a fragile truth, finally freed. His friend didn't speak. Hopkins continued, his gaze fixed on some distant point only he could see. "I waited for someone to tell me I mattered, that I wasn't invisible, that I belonged somewhere." A soft, trembling breath escaped him. But no one ever did. Silence fell between them, but this silence had weight. It was a silence the world rarely sees, the kind that reveals, not hides, the essence of a person. Hopkins went on. "All my life I tried to outrun that feeling. Every role, every performance, I poured myself into them because it was the only place I felt seen." His voice softened further. "Not loved, seen." It was not self-pity, it was truth, distilled. In the applause, I felt, for a moment, that I wasn't that lonely boy anymore. But when the applause stopped, he always came back. He lifted a hand weakly, then let it fall. And now, at 90, I realize that boy never wanted fame. He wanted a voice to tell him he mattered. The room grew impossibly quiet. That, he whispered, is the secret I've carried. I spent a lifetime being celebrated by the world, while feeling forgotten by the one person I needed most, myself. His friend finally reached out, placing a hand gently over Hopkins's. Hopkins didn't cry. Instead, his face softened with a peace that had eluded him for decades. "Thank you," he murmured, "for listening. It feels lighter now." In that moment, the legend faded, and the man remained. A man who had been waiting his whole life to speak the truth that shaped him more than any role he had ever played. The truth that fame could never silence, the truth that even genius could not erase. And with that confession, Anthony Hopkins finally stepped out of the shadow he had lived in since childhood. One final, devastatingly human revelation. After Anthony Hopkins spoke his final truth, the atmosphere in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Something eased in him, something uncoiled. The weight that had lived behind his eyes for 9 decades seemed to soften, replaced by a fragile but undeniable calm. It was as if the child he once was, the lonely boy from Margam, had finally been allowed to speak through the man he became. In the days that followed, those around him noticed the change. He wasn't suddenly stronger, nor was he free from age's frailties, but there was a clarity in him, a gentleness that felt like a door closing without regret. He no longer lived under the pressure of perfection or the fear of invisibility. He had named his deepest wound, and in doing so, allowed it to settle instead of haunting him. Outside his home, the world continued to admire him, not just as a titan of cinema, but as a soul who had dared to reveal what very few ever admit. People revisited his performances, watching them with new eyes. They saw the tenderness beneath Hannibal Lecter's precision, the vulnerability inside his most stoic characters, the quiet longing that seemed to flicker in moments too brief to notice before. Suddenly, his acting felt less like technique and more like confession. And perhaps that was his greatest legacy, the reminder that even the brightest among us can feel unseen, and even the most celebrated can carry a silence that no amount of fame can drown. Hopkins' truth didn't diminish him. It deepened him. It made him human again, in the most extraordinary way. Because sometimes what remains of a life is not the applause, nor the achievements, nor the shimmering moments of triumph, but the courage to finally say what hurt the most. As the sun set across the horizon on one of his final evenings, Hopkins sat by the window, eyes half closed, bathed in a warm, fading light. There was no sorrow in him, only acceptance. And he left the world with a quiet, enduring question. How many of us spend our entire lives trying to be seen, while never learning to see ourselves? And how different might our lives be if we dared to speak the truth we've carried alone for so long? Thank you for listening to his story. May it help someone, somewhere, finally find the courage to face their own.